Behold, my glorious supporter, EyePatchNotes, has requested some discussion about stat efficiency versus slot efficiency, how they relate. Let me explain what those two concepts are, and then we'll get into it. This is a glorious build crafting topic, worthy of being placed on my face. EyePatchNotes asks, may I request a parlay about stat efficiency and slot efficiency? I view buildcraft, EyePatchNotes views buildcraft, in most games on a spectrum of slot efficiency and stat efficiency. For a rich example, we can take a look at the obviously good Warframe mods like Weeping Wounds. Weeping Wounds seems like a one-slot solution for status chance, but there are quite a number of strings attached. As a combo scaling mod, it pairs both well with Blood Rush and asks for combo management somewhere in the whole loadout. Including yet other mods like base damage and attack speed, it can be difficult to fit combined elements or comfort mods for life gain or range. From this lens, Weeping Wounds can be considered stat efficient, but not slot efficient. Okay, that's a good starting point. So let's talk about Weeping Wounds as an example first. So Weeping Wounds is, of course, a Warframe mod that gives you status chance based on how much combo counter you have. So it gives you a ton of status chance, right? Crazy amount. If you compare to dual status elemental mods that give you, a bit of status, bit of elemental damage, it gives you way more status, crazy amount more status if you're building combo. But there are a lot of costs. There are a lot of different kinds of costs. First of all, you need to be using a combo-focused build, or it's usually not very good. You just don't get that much status if you don't have a lot of combo. Even an initial combo heavy attack build usually doesn't have enough for that to be particularly powerful. So you need to be using a certain kind of build. Okay, that already balances it out because it means that that type of build has its own payoffs. But then as long as there are payoffs for other kinds of builds, there's no problem there. But there's more. Of course, you often want to use other things alongside it. One of the factors about different multipliers in video games is that while it gives you many ways to increase something's damage, it also puts pressure on you where, yes, you can get a ton of status here, but getting multiple things at the same time has a lot of value as well. And when you use Weeping Wounds, you're not getting your status from a mod that also gives you an element. So for example, let's say that you run 2 dual status elements. That's 2 of your 8 mod slots on your weapon, but you not only have meaningfully more status, a lot less than Weeping Wounds, but meaningfully more, you also have a combined element that you want, right? With only 2 slots, which is pretty efficient. You kind of got 3 things for 2 slots. You got the element, and then the status. Generally, when thinking about the one build to rule them all in Warframe in general, the status and then the combined element are considered to be the 2 multipliers you get for those 2 slots. When you run Weeping Wounds, you only get one thing, you get status. You get way more of it, that totally matters, but you kind of need to use 2 more mod slots, because even if you have all the status in the world, you still need the elements. And so there's a way in which, yes, you gain a lot of status for that extra slot, but you just get even more of it. You don't get another multiplier, and you kind of have to use a slot. And so there's a way in which it's not that it's bad, but it's a trade-off. There's a sort of stat versus slot trade-off there, right? And then, of course, there is the fact that you need to enable combos. You need to have a way to maintain your combo counter, right? So this concept in games overall is really interesting. It's something that makes buildcraft kind of a rich experience, is how the different amounts of space you have on a loadout, different places to put stats, can matter. And then you also have motivations depending on what you put on your loadout. You might add something, and then to really get that to pay off, you kind of have to add other stuff. I have a few related topics to discuss, but I want to give you another example. Something that I really like to become consistent at is demonstrating that these concepts don't just apply to Warframe, because they don't at all. I think it's just kind of easier in some ways Warframe is a very good example, but there are also other good examples. So the one I'm going to give you is Genshin Impact. In Genshin Impact, you don't have weapons with mods or whatever. You have a pretty simple setup. You have your character, who has one innate stat that's unique to them. So for example, every character gets attack and defense and health as they level up, but each character also has their own special stat that they also get as they level up innately. So for example, a character might just get a percentage of their attack more as they level up, or hydro damage will be increased by a percent as they level up, or energy recharge, or physical damage, or some such, right? Critical damage, defense, it could be whatever. All the stats in the game are pretty much available. And so they have one of those that's just innate to the character. Then you have your weapon, which gives you attack, makes you do more damage, but then it has one stat that can change. So it could be crit damage, defense, any of those stats. So it's got one slot for that. That's on your weapon. And then you have your 5 artifacts. 2 of them are always health and attack, respectively. And then the remaining 3 have a few options. Only one of them can be like hydro damage, pyro damage, that multiplier, and only one of them can have crit or crit damage. You cannot have 2 artifacts that have crit chance and then crit damage, as you would think you'd want, as 2 separate stats. You can get a little bit of them in the random substats, but we won't get into that here. The point is that, for example, this means that in Genshin Impact, you cannot get crit and crit damage within your artifacts alone. So you have to either get it from your weapon or from your Warframe, or maybe you could get it from some other effect, maybe an artifact. It's not quite that simple, but this is just an example, right? And so that inordinately places value on crit on weapons. Even if the amount of crit or crit damage that you get from a weapon in Genshin Impact is balanced, or maybe even not that good, you don't get that much crit chance, for example. It's made inordinately more powerful by the fact that you just can't get that very many other places. You don't have much of a choice. You kind of have to get it there, unless your character has it innately, or you can somehow get more some other way. Again, we won't get into it too much. A topic for another time, an interesting topic for another time, but just an example, right? And so that places a certain amount of pressure on loadouts and weapons to, if they don't have crit as one of their stats, then the weapon has to have a really good ability to make up for that, because you're really losing not just one multiplier, but now what do you even do with that artifact that can be crit chance or crit damage? Because if you don't enable it by having the other one, then you can't use it. You don't have that multiplier now. Usually what you do is get crit chance, and characters innately have a little crit damage, 50%. So your crits will be kind of weak, but it's still more damage. It's not like you can't do anything with it. It's a well-designed game in that respect. But the point is that there's some kind of further cost, some kind of domino effect implication to picking a certain stat in a certain place. And that's exactly the case here. What I want to suggest, getting back to EyePatchNotes' question directly, is that stat efficiency and slot efficiency are kind of the same thing. I think of them as kind of the same thing. You said thinking of them on a spectrum of slot efficiency and stat efficiency. Yeah, I mean, I guess they are. I think that it's sort of the same thing. When you evaluate what something is giving you, you have to think, okay, well, this is giving me this stat, and it's a lot of this stat. If you convert, how much attack can you get in this game? How much does a point of attack increase your overall damage? How much electro damage can I get in this game? How much does a point of electro damage give you for your overall damage? How much is a point of crit chance worth? You could convert that all into a number to find out what the value of that stat is, and then you could evaluate this piece of gear, this mod, this weapon, how much is this worth just overall? And obviously it depends on how much you have of your other multipliers too. Actually calculating that out is pretty hard a lot of the time. It's not impossible at all, but it's challenging. It takes some doing, which is why I so often like to focus on talking about the philosophy that can get you to the right answer. Essentially, all things being equal, you want to even out your multipliers. So if you have, in Genshin Impact, if you have one source of attack %, one source of, so let's say physical damage %, one source of crit chance, one source of crit damage, and then one source of, a good base attack weapon or some kind of further attack buff, that's pretty good. You basically have your multipliers taken care of. Or maybe you can get some other, like elemental mastery. We won't get into that in Genshin Impact, but same thing in Warframe. If you have one mod that gives you crit chance, one mod that gives you crit damage, one mod that gives you, a combined status element, but as we talked about before, usually what happens is you have 2 mods that give you collectively a combined element and status chance, which you can kind of view as 2 separate multipliers. One mod that gives you base damage, one mod that gives you multi-shot, and then you've kind of got an open slot. A lot of the time we just add more multi-shot because it kind of gives you more crit as well. It gives you crit consistency, and it gives you more status most of the time on most kinds of weapons. So it's just a good overall bonus, right? That's usually how you arrive at the best build. If you math it out, that is the best build for most weapons. You don't have to check. You can use this intuitive idea to get something that is, if it's not literally the absolute best build for a weapon, it's very good. You won't be able to do much better by finagling something else. And so unless the game demands extremely strict damage of you, you can make hundreds of builds and save hundreds of hours of mathing it out, and be confident that the builds are very good by using this intuitive way of thinking about a build, which is what I think is more valuable. I think that of all the games in the world, yeah, like for Warframe, sure, I've played this game for almost 5,000 hours, according to my Steam time. That's not in mission time, because I'm always in the build screen, but the modding screen. But during that time, of course, you could do the math if you wanted to. But okay, it's not like you're only going to play one game in your life. You want something that can transfer over. And so what I'm getting at is that concepts like this, stat efficiency, slot efficiency, I kind of think it's the same thing. The efficiency, the marginal cost, the opportunity cost, the marginal benefit, those are separate things. The opportunity cost of these things and the stat value, I guess is what I'm going to call it, are really interesting and valuable to understand as concepts rather than in a specific game, because they transfer over. You just need to understand how to translate them into a given game. And so this is an important topic in that way. I've waffled on about my take on it. EyePatchNotes has done their signature thing where they block out with spoilers some other details that they want to add. So now we'll look at those. So EyePatchNotes, you said personal analysis of Warframe's current mod offerings. Mods perceived as bad are generally neither stat efficient nor slot efficient. Even mods without explicit downsides can be viewed as inefficient, such as the Bane mods. We'll talk about that in a sec. That's a good example. Other times, the sole stat offered is undesirable, such as status duration at the time of this writing, or anything involving the lifted status. Philosophically, most mods would benefit from gaining efficiency on at least one scale. The weapon category specific mods, what I refer to as class mods for brevity, we're talking about like sniper mods, shotgun mod, well, kind of not shotgun mods, but you get the point, happen to follow this philosophy already. The primed element mods, for example, can easily skew the weapon toward a combined element with the same 2-slot cost. However, I perceive class mods like Shred and Stunning Speed as the real breadwinners here. By taking a little off the top of a dedicated plus fire rate plus reload speed mod, they include comfort stats without losing a mod slot. Indeed, I think that one of the places this is important is to give a slot in a given game identity. So for example, I mentioned that in Genshin Impact, there's a very simple example of this where only your crown, one of your artifacts, only that one, and your weapon can innately have critical stats as one of their main stats. Your character can too, but the point is of the gear pieces you're choosing for that character. And so it's kind of a characteristic of your crown and your weapon that those things have to be on point. You need to really think about which one you're picking for those, because there's a huge difference between picking something really good and picking something that mathematically or intuitively doesn't really hold up. Whereas there are other stats in Genshin Impact, like your, I would say your clock, where you get to choose what stat you pick, but there aren't very many choices, and it doesn't really matter that much. You usually pick attack, and it's not very hard to get attack elsewhere in that game. Much the same in Warframe. When you add that second multi-shot mod that we often add on our builds in the one build to rule them all in Warframe, okay, but it doesn't matter that much if you pick something else, whereas the other multipliers, if you don't pick crit damage with your crit chance is a lot less good. If you don't pick the second status elemental to make the combined element you want, not only does your first status elemental not really give you useful status chance because you have something you want to be proccing, maybe not, it also kind of doesn't give useful damage because you don't have a damage type that you're looking for. So you really need to interlock the mods that way. And that gives some flavor to the way that you build weapons in Warframe. I'm not sure I think it's that great, but I think the way they interlock is the real cause of this one build to rule them all thing. By comparison, base damage mods are actually not a big deal at all. There's a lot of ways to get base damage in Warframe that people just don't use that often, and you don't need base damage to make everything else work. It just makes it do more damage, so you can get it somewhere else and get a little bit of a different amount, and it's fine. It's all base damage, whatever, you know? Getting back to this thing about signature, things in a class, like weapons and your crown in Genshin Impact are characterized by being sources of crit. You also have, EyePatchNotes is giving this good example where, when you have a rifle, you have access to shred. So if you want to add fire rate, there's a fire rate mod for rifles only that also gives you punch through. And so you kind of get that for free. You still get a significant amount of fire rate, but then you also get punch through. A really simple example is on secondaries. The second multi-shot mod for secondaries, Lethal Torrent, is also a fire rate mod, so you get that fire rate for very much for free. You would already want to use that mod anyway, even if it didn't have fire rate on it a lot of the time. So you kind of get fire rate for free. Shotguns, for example, have chilling reload. If you want to include cold as one of your elements, and you're willing to lose a little bit of status chance, you can get significant reload speed kind of for free. Again, it's not completely free, but it's rolled in this other way. It creates some slot efficiency. These are mods that add the ability to incorporate another multiplier, or again, something effective into your build for much less of a marginal cost. You can basically save a slot. They're very slot efficient. Sometimes they sacrifice a little bit of stat efficiency. You get multiple things, but they're either not good together or you get less of each of them. So for example, a mod might give you crit chance and crit damage, but you get less of each than if they were combined and they were just one. There's an arc gun, that one heavy weapon mod where you aim critical focus. It's probably called critical focus. And you get I actually forget exactly how much, but you get a lot less crit chance and a lot less crit damage, but you get both. And so in that's slot efficient, but not very stat efficient in a certain way. It actually is pretty stat efficient. A lot of the mods in Warframe that have multiple stats are actually pretty efficient, which is weird because Warframe is a game where you want multiple stats almost all of the time. It's a game where there are a lot of multipliers, and so you would very rarely not want multiple stats. The only reason you wouldn't would be if for some reason you got less total, but in Warframe you often get more total stats in exchange for the price of having multiple stats that you want instead of one stat. It's not really a cost. And so one other thing we can talk about here is this sort of interesting way in which games have a different philosophy about what you need to give up if you want a certain thing, right? Genshin Impact is a simple example of this. In Genshin Impact, there are very few multipliers. Generally, it's just attack percent, damage percent in all its forms, we'll get back to that, and then crits. So damage percent can come in a lot of flavors. Let's say I'm doing 1,000 pyro damage. Maybe that's affected by some amount of attack percent, and then the attack, maybe it's an elemental skill. The damage percent stat could be pyro damage, or it could be elemental skill damage, or a combination of both. They're the same multiplier, they're additive. This is very similar to how in Warframe, if you were to put a heat mod on your weapon and then a slash mod, those are additive with each other. Slash and heat are both multiplying the base damage. They're multiplying something, but not each other. They're giving you damage based on your base damage. Status, maybe the status effect, and then crits will later multiply that, but that slash mod and that heat mod do not multiply each other. It's just damage that you add to your total damage that you're getting from your base damage. Likewise, in Genshin Impact, if you have elemental skill damage and pyro damage, and then you do a pyro elemental skill, it kind of sounds like those would multiply, but they don't. They just add together. And so it's interesting to see how in Genshin Impact, the game really puts some pressure on you to consider, well, pyro damage, a lot of things could be pyro damage, but your elemental skill, it's your one elemental skill. So generally you get more elemental skill damage. For example, from artifact set bonuses, you often get 15% of an elemental damage type because it can apply to more things, and 20% of elemental skill or elemental burst damage because those are more narrow. Now, I don't think that trade-off is particularly even. A lot of the time, I think the skill and burst damage amount you get is really just not good. You're only getting 5% more damage, and it's limiting. So I feel like there's not a huge amount of a payoff there. The sets those are attached to are fine, but whatever. The point is, you pay for versatility. You have to get a little less damage if you want a more versatile damage bonus. And it goes further than that. We won't get into it too much. In Warframe, this is really not true. In fact, I think one of the things that is not very well designed about Warframe's modding system in general is that you don't really pay much for a lot of stat diversity. It's usually not costly to run many different stats. There might be a chance that a build where you don't stack all these multipliers would be good if you had to pay more to get all these multipliers, but you don't. We have powerful mods that give you multiple multipliers all over the place. Shred, we mentioned before. The status elements are a huge part of the game, and they give you status, and again, they can be built together to give you 2 multipliers. So that's an example. Shred, Lethal Torrent, these are some other examples. And I don't think that they're bad on their own. Again, they do this thing where they give some character to, this weapon is a primary weapon. If you made it a secondary weapon, it would be different because it would have lethal torrent, but it wouldn't have shred or chilling reload or something. Just a few examples. You gave stunning speed as another example. I think that that's good in isolation, but there are also mods like what comes to mind is Hammershot. Hammershot gives you crit damage and status chance, and in exchange for giving you two things that could quite feasibly be part of a build in a way that you'd want, it gives you less of them, right? No, it gives you more of them. Why? Much the same with, again, I think critical focus doesn't actually give you less stat efficiency in exchange for giving you crit chance and crit damage. It gives you a pretty good deal on those two stats, even though you have multiple stats from one mod, which should be valuable, which means it could come at a cost and still be powerful, but it doesn't come at a cost. In Warframe, that's a thing that the developing just has not done. The way that the game has been made, you just don't really pay much for having a lot of stats in a single place. And so you get these interesting, but I don't think entirely intentional situations where Weeping Wounds is massively stat efficient, but not that slot efficient in kind of a backwards way. I mean, it gives you one multiplier, right? So what's the big deal? A status element gives you one multiplier per mod. If you put on both status elements, you get one multiplier per mod. You get two multipliers, the combined element and the status. And yet it's bad that Weeping Wounds gives you only one stat for one slot. What's the big deal? What's wrong with that, right? And of course the reason is that it's not quite that simple. It seems very simple if you say it quickly, but in reality the problem is that the status chance doesn't do much unless you have a status effect you're going to activate that you want. You might have that innately. Some weapons do, and those weapons are really good, but a lot of the time you need to build on that element anyway, so there's a sort of hidden cost because the game doesn't ask you to pay much for slot efficiency, for having multiple stats from one slot and a decent amount of them as well. You end up paying a sort of hidden cost if you use a mod that is very stat efficient, but not very slot efficient, which is an interesting fact about Warframe and definitely something to analyze when you play a game. Is there a way in which the game makes you pay, in the way it's designed, a sort of hidden cost for getting a lot of a stat here? In Warframe, it's usually pretty bad to just pile on a lot of something. You care much more about getting many different sources of a thing, and one of the reasons is because of this development choice, where getting slot efficiency is just not expensive. It's just not a big deal. Whereas stat efficiency is often maybe a little more expensive. It's something they seem to focus on much more. You could be very critical and cynical and say Warframe is a game developed as though the developers don't know what slot efficiency is. It's a game that is developed as though there is no such thing as slot efficiency. A lot of divine interventions in Warframe give the impression of being in a game where you have infinite mod slots, but you don't. And a lot of the build's actual structure comes from the fact that you have 8 mod slots, but the game is developed as though you don't in some ways. It isn't necessarily actually developed that way. I'm just saying I would understand if somebody felt that. I've heard people say that before, but I don't think that's actually true. I'm just saying I think it's an example of how you could think about this thing. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting topic. I think that it's most interesting when comparing games to each other. Maybe we should do another one. Yes. So an example would be Hades. Hades is a game where the value of a separate multiplier is huge because there are practically none. In Hades, almost every source of damage is additive. In fact, I think they all are. If it says a % damage, I think that's always additive. I could be mistaken. But crits are, of course, separate. There aren't a lot of sources of crits. It's pretty much Artemis. And so if you are getting something that somehow increases your damage in some other way, it's usually worth a lot because there are very few sources of that. You have to really sacrifice something in order to get it most of the time. For example, when you get one of Artemis's boons to give, let's say, your attack crit, you get the ability to crit. It's not a huge chance to crit. We're at 15-20%, And then the % damage bonus you get for that thing is very low in exchange. And the thing is that Hades doesn't often have a lot of things that directly stack. And so you might be able to finagle some way to get base damage on that attack that you allowed to crit, and then you would be removing the drawback of having that ability to crit. You still have a lot of damage, and you have crit. You have 2 multipliers. Excellent. You will do big damage. But it's hard. The main way would be Chaos, who gives you boons very randomly and at a drawback. And so if you wanted to just get 2 multipliers, there's a huge slot efficiency cost. It's kind of a weird slot efficiency, but time in your run. It takes up some time and opportunity cost in your run to go get that other stat. On the other hand, what Hades doesn't mind at all is something that we didn't really discuss for most of this video, and it's a separate topic, but I wanted to touch on it here at the end, which is the idea of what the cost is of getting multiple things that buff different separate aspects of your build. So for example, going back to that Genshin Impact example I gave, let's say I have a character that does pyro damage with their skill and their burst ability. I get pyro damage, let's say I get 50%. So both my skill and my burst now do 50% more damage. Cool, that was efficient. And then let's say I have the opportunity to get 100% more skill damage. All right, so now I'll do 150% more damage because they don't multiply, they're additive with my skill, and 50% with my burst. And then I might have the option to get 100% more burst damage. But it's weird because I've already invested into my skill, and so the marginal benefit, opportunity cost, it's not really either of those things, of making my burst more powerful is kind of weird because while it is a good marginal benefit relative to my burst in isolation, in the context of my character overall, I already have a skill that is built into a lot. So if I could get something that affected that, that'd be really powerful, and I would probably be willing to pay some sort of cost, a stat or slot efficiency cost of some kind to get that. And so it's comparatively more forgivable to give me a generous amount of a buff that doesn't affect something I already have a lot of power invested in. Hades is huge on this. So when you get your boons for your attack and your special and your whatever, generally they're totally separate. And Hades is totally freewheeling with that kind of thing. You can have a ton of power for your special, and then your special's really powerful. We won't really give you much more for your special, or you can get it, but it's really hard. But will extremely trivially give you something for your attack that's worth a lot in isolation, because they don't affect each other. It makes something else in your playstyle more powerful. And this creates a thing where in Hades, you need to find a way to get more damage out of more of your kit if you want more damage, rather than simply stacking up a lot of effects on one thing. It's popular in the Hades community, and with me, to try to make the game not do that, and instead stack up a bunch of effects on one attack, because it's powerful if you can do it. You just usually can't. The game isn't really designed. It's not the game isn't designed that way, but there's a cost to doing that. It's just so powerful that it's generally worth the price. But it's interesting how Hades is defined more by making another part of your loadout more powerful rather than separate multipliers. It's much more about giving you another tool, which can be a separate multiplier on your ability to use your other tools in practice rather than raw damage, which is very interesting. I don't think it's bad or good necessarily. That's cool. And then in Warframe, it's very much the opposite. You almost never put something on a weapon that somehow doesn't affect anything the weapon was doing already. Really, the easy example I can think of would be if you have a weapon that's very slashy, and then you add corrosive to it, and you have a lot of status chance, getting a corrosive status effect doesn't make your slash status effects any better than they were before. It does make you do more damage. They just don't. Removing those corrosive status effects would not make the slash part of the build do any less damage. It's like using your skill and your burst together, but they're not related. They don't help each other in some way. They just both do more damage, but just linearly more damage. And obviously investing in 2 different ways to do a lot of damage is going to be less efficient than having one way that you multiply over and over again. It's just that in Warframe that you can do that. The game is about doing that. In Hades, you mostly can't do that. In Genshin Impact, it's kind of a compromise. You have to think about it. If I'm playing Razor, and my attacks do physical damage, but then also a meaningful hit of electro damage, and I've got a big electro damage spike with my Claw Slam, do I get physical damage or electro damage? Well, it would be a lot better if I could get something that just gave me let's say normal attack damage, and then hopefully that probably doesn't apply to Razor's electro hit from his burst skill, but the point is it would be nice if I got something that just made me do more damage in general, because all things being equal, that's going to affect both halves of my kit. That's good. And there are a lot of games that either are not interested in that concept at all. Hades is much more about you just get a totally separate but also powerful thing, or Warframe that is eminently interested in that, pretty much only that. When you get more power, it's almost always for the same thing that you were powering up before. It's quite rare to have a weapon where you're building two entirely separate aspects of it. And indeed, in Warframe, that's pretty bad most of the time. If you have corrosive on a slashy weapon, you're doing it wrong. Like if you put viral on, it's pretty much always better. And so that's an interesting difference between those two games. Okay, that was... EyePatchNotes and I were discussing the other day how I always have really long answers to these parlays, and I don't think that's a bad thing, but I do think that there's a balance to be had between saying the good thing I have to say and not waffling on, and I wonder how we did. So folks, I'll accept a little criticism at the beginning of the new year, as I always like to, but this is as good a time as any, better time than most. Do you think that I did a good job spending this time efficiently? Did you feel like I was being to the point and getting things across effectively? Or do you feel I was waffling, as good as waffles are? You may like waffles. That's perfectly acceptable. Give me your opinions on eating waffles in the description, comments, down there part of this video. And thank you, EyePatchNotes, for your glorious request.